Hello, AP World History students. Mr. Lassiter here with you today, kind of guest starring for today's Fiveable cast, taking a look at key concept 4.2, but something very specific, that is labor systems. We're going to be focusing primarily today on changes and continuities and thinking about that concept within the within kind of this realm of labor systems today. We can go a little bit further than that if we're pretty good with time, but I think there will probably be quite a few questions that will stem from what we're going to go through today. Again, you're of course used to Amanda or Dylan doing this. They've been doing a great job this year. I teach AP World History at a school in Durham, North Carolina. I have some YouTube stuff out there you may have seen or used. Hopefully it's helpful. And hopefully this session today is helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and throw up my screen and we will get started here. So I've titled this Changes and Continuities, looking at labor systems from 1450 to 1750. And we're going to be thinking today about the ways that labor systems in this early modern era changed, and then what aspects of labor stay the same. And of course, that's the whole idea between with change and continuity. This deals with key concept 4.2. If you ever want to know what's going to be on the test, you got to look at the key concepts. And this is new forms of social organization and modes of production. And of course, labor systems really have to do with that modes of production, although there will be a lot of crossover with social organizations. So this key concept 4.2 covers the Little Ice Age. They kind of stick it right in there. It's just kind of offhanded mentioning. I'd say you want to know some stuff on Little Ice Age, look at Crash Course. That's what I assign my kids. But this deals also with peasant labor and coerced labor. That is what we're going to focus on today in this session, thinking about these two things. It also deals with ethnic, racial, and gender hierarchies. And certainly what we're going to talk about with peasant labor, especially coerced labor, is going to impact these hierarchies. But there, of course, is a great deal more information on them, but that may be for another time. Before we really get started talking about these labor systems themselves, though, I think it's worthwhile to see how this has been tested in recent years. And I'm not going to pull up multiple choice questions from the test that you may have seen in your classes, because these topics on peasant labor or coerced labor are very popular. But in two of the last 4 years, this topic has, or something related to this topic has come up for this time period. And so I want to take a look at these. In 2015, back in a few years ago, we had what was called a change in continuity over time essay. Now it's just a part of the LEQ. It's just one more historical thinking skill. But the essay was to analyze continuities and changes in labor systems in one of the following regions from 1450 to 1900. So a little bit broader than the time period I'm going to be talking about today, but nevertheless, it is looking at changes and continuities in these labor systems. Latin America and the Caribbean, North America, this is the area we're going to be talking about mostly today. This other thing that came up was on the test a couple years ago, asking about labor migration in the time period 1450 to 1750. And of course, that has a great deal to do with labor in this key concept. So this is a topic that is kind of fresh on the minds of AP graders, AP readers, and the people who make the test. So I would not be surprised if you see several questions about it, either in multiple choice or perhaps in short answer questions this year. So hopefully this session will at minimum help you break through with one of those. So all that being said, you now know who I am, you know what we're going to do. Let's get thinking about it. The first thing is thinking about what change in continuity over time is and what labor systems are. And this might be kind of duh. I don't know how much you deal with this in your class day to day. But overall, changes are of course pretty easy. This is something that we are trained to identify, right? So things are some way in history, and then they are some other way in history. Of course, having a strong content knowledge base helps with identifying some of these changes, but that's generally the easy part, I find, in my teaching. The continuities can seem a lot more difficult, oftentimes because they are quite mundane. You don't see something like very exciting. You know, people don't generally talk about things that just have stayed the same since your parents were children, right? We talk about what has changed, the changes in technology or whatever they might be. So oftentimes in our history classes, those are given less emphasis. And I'm going to try to pick out a couple continuities today just to make sure that we don't pay short shrift to those and that we cover them adequately. So with continuities, the key when you're learning is to be very intentional about committing these continuities to memory, so that if you need to reach in and go back to your knowledge from the class, you can answer them with ease. And then when we talk about labor system, this is a term that a lot of times when people see it on a test, they kind of freak out, right? They see, oh, labor system, that seems like it must be something really hard. But it's really one of the easiest topics, especially from 1450 to 1750, because it is something that you've probably learned a great deal about. And it just seems to make sense in kind of the grand scheme of things. So this is kind of, if we're thinking about the themes, if your teachers kind of organize the course in themes, it fits with economics. It certainly is going to cross over, though, with social effects. So let's take a look. The first thing I want to talk about today is peasant agricultural labor. So this is, of course, one of the most significant labor systems that has existed in, well, all of world history, and certainly is important in 1450 to present. So let's kind of think about changes and continuities in peasant agricultural labor. If we look directly at the key concepts, which you see here from the College Board, traditional peasant agriculture is going to increase and change. Part of that is because we see a demand for what is produced increase, the global demand for raw materials, finished products. And so the ultimate change we see is that peasant labor intensifies in many regions. And so that's kind of our first big change. I want to just kind of do a quick question here, something we're going to cover here in just a second, but make sure that people are kind of involved, paying attention. And you can hit this in the chat. Which of the following countries used peasant labor to expand its empire by settling outlying territories? So look at this question, look at your answer choices, and I will wait for the delay to go through and see generally what you think on this. Give it a shot, not the end of the world if you get it wrong. So which of these countries used peasant labor to expand its empire? There's one specific example that really comes out of the early modern period here. All right. Well, we've got nobody has said C yet. We got a lot of A's, B's, and D's. So let's see where we end up. I'll give you a moment longer. Even if I've started back, feel free to answer that question, and we'll think about it. All right. So let's see what the answer is going to be momentarily. So let's think about the change. Let's start with kind of a we're starting with peasant agricultural labor. We're going to see changes. We're going to see continuities in this, but let's start first with changes. And it is that idea that peasant agriculture intensified. And one thing that we see with peasant agriculture is that it's going to intensify pretty much everywhere. One of the results you saw in the video last week of the voyages of exploration with Europeans was that the Colombian exchange occurs, right? And the biospheres of the Eastern and Western hemisphere become much more homogeneous. We see foodstuffs moving back and forth. In Afro-Eurasia, that meant that with a more diverse diet and foods that are a little bit easier to grow, that populations skyrocket. You can see here in this chart, looking at continental Europe and China as just two examples, that between 1450 and 1600, populations blow up. Well, a higher population needs more food, and certainly that is predominantly grown by peasant agriculture. So one reason for the intensification of this peasant labor, if that is your change in an essay that you're writing about, and you're wanting to explain why this peasant agriculture intensifies in places like China or England or Europe, it would be because there was a greater demand for food, or perhaps because new foodstuffs were introduced to Europe, allowing for population growth, thus needing more agriculture. Now, that's just kind of a general one, kind of keeping in mind that peasant agriculture is going to increase. But there are three specific examples in the key concepts that we want to make sure to cover. And I'm going to keep referring to those because since they're in there, in the key concepts, they're more likely to be asked on your test or be more likely covered in a document or a source that you would see on your test. So first, let's start in China, where peasant labor wasn't just used to farm rice or crops that were introduced from the Americas. In China, we also see, as a result of the increase in trade that's going on in the world, a demand for Chinese goods, particularly silk, of course. That is kind of the dominant Chinese good throughout history, silk along with porcelain. But in China, because of this high demand for silk by Europeans, and also because the Chinese wanted to gobble up the silver that was flowing in across the Pacific from the Spanish Americas into China, they took peasants, right, and they moved them from perhaps rice farming and other modes of agriculture production into silk production. And so China ramps up silk production by using peasants to meet this demand. And that is one example of this intensification of peasant labor. Again, in this case, I think it's mulberry plants, something like that, where the types of caterpillars that create the silk cocoons, where they take up, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, take up housing, I think would be the name. So these Chinese peasants are there to cultivate these, and then, of course, to conduct this silk process. You can see that in the image here, to spin the silk, and then, of course, eventually it goes out into the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Europeans take it, and then they, do what Europeans do with silk, wear it, I guess. Another example of this we see in Mughal India. Now, with trade, trade in the early modern period has its ups and downs, right? In general, we see an intensification of trade, but depending on the commodity, prices go up and down. And in Mughal India in this time period, there was a lull or so, or a decline in the price of spices. Now, of course, the trade of spices was one of the most important aspects of global trade. It was one of the reasons why Europeans wanted to move into the Indian Ocean. But with the decline in the price of spices, there was a subsequent, or a kind of an opposite thing happening with cotton. Europeans had fallen in love with this new fabric, the fabric of our lives, some might say, where cotton product, or where so let me back up. So they had fallen in love with this fabric, and a major source for this fabric at this point in history, in the early modern period, is India. So with the rise in the prices of cotton because of the demand for it, Mughal India starts to transition peasants and force them into the production of cotton within India. This can be seen kind of in these images too. One of the kind of more, I think the term might be, I don't know, upscale. I'm not, again, not a scientist, not a fashion guru here. One of the forms cotton takes is as muslin, which is this kind of thin, very soft form of cotton. On the left there in the image, you can see a woman in India wearing this fabric. And on the right, Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, who loses her head, wearing her own cotton gown. So this was in high demand, this cotton was. And because of it, and because of the prices this cotton fetched, Mughal India shifts peasant labor into cotton production, again, intensifying it in that specific region. Another change that takes place in labor, specifically peasant labor. And then the last one for these examples is seen in Russia. And this is the answer to the question you had earlier. So if you chose A, you were correct. In Russia, we see that in that country, the government uses peasant farmers not just to grow plants that can house caterpillars to create silk, or not just to grow cotton, but they actually use it as a tool to settle Eastern territory, a tool to settle Siberia, in fact. The government encouraged this peasant agriculture, these peasant farmers, to settle in Siberia. They encouraged them by giving them seeds to plant, giving them grain to feed themselves, providing them with tools. And this was part of Russia's imperial expansion to the east. In our next time period, in time period 5, this is often compared to, I know this is a change of continuity essay, but we're thinking about comparing, we may want to think about comparison as well. This is often compared to the settlement of the West by the United States, where the US would grant land to anybody who would move out west. So Russia does the same thing in order to take a greater hold of its eastern lands. Eventually, of course, in the early modern period, stretching Russia from its capital in Moscow all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So, so there's the answer to your question, and that wraps up some of the changes that we see in peasant agricultural labor, particularly the intensification of it. Now, what's change without continuity? So, I want to briefly talk about this, although, as I said, oftentimes continuities are mundane, and sometimes it just depends how you frame your change of continuity, depending on where you might put it. So in terms of thinking of a continuity with peasant agricultural labor, for the most part, if we think about peasant labor at all, it is still the dominant form of labor in pre-industrial society. So this is something that is certainly kind of worth noting. Even though we have trading taking place across the world, most people are still poor farmers. Like, that doesn't really change much in the modern era. There's a lot of things that change in world history, but for the most part, the poor farmers are still going to be a poor farmer, whether or not they're serfs or free agricultural labor. So in Europe, for example, we're going to continue to see peasant farmers. Perhaps their station has changed as feudalism declines and dies out, and we start to see free peasant farmers, especially after the Black Death has changed the landscape of Europe. We've already seen in India, in China, this peasant agricultural labor, saw it in Russia. So that is going to continue in this time period. And that's ultimately kind of some changes and continuities that we see in this one aspect of labor. So if you have any questions, I know there's a few popping up. So I will go through and see if there are any specific questions that I can answer in the meantime. There is a good question here. So a couple questions that I kind of missed earlier, thinking about how are labor systems going to be referenced on the test. Dylan, I think that was a solid answer. Thinking about what do I mean when I refer to labor systems. I think I covered that a little bit earlier, so sorry if I missed your question. There is a question here from Charles. What would peasant labor be a continuity in the labor system of sub-Saharan Africa? Do African societies rely on slave labor throughout this time period? I will be addressing that in a little bit. There is slave labor in Africa during this time period. Peasant agriculture, I assume we could classify some agricultural labor in Africa as peasant agriculture. A lot of subsistence agriculture goes on in agricultural societies of sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, there are also some pastoral societies in sub-Saharan Africa where we would not see that peasant labor in this time period. I'm just going to scroll through, make sure I haven't missed anything here. We're going to cover slavery in a little bit. I see a lot of questions popping up dealing with that. And then another good question here, what types of labor systems are going to be compared on this test, or is it mostly random? Well, I don't think it's going to be entirely random. You certainly can expect questions on peasant agriculture, and it may not be from this time period. It could be from up to 1450. It could be after 1750, but it's what we've gone through, and those changes in continuities are certainly fair game. As far as some of the labor systems that we're about to talk about, I think you're going to get something from the smorgasbord that I'm going to provide you. So if you know some of these that I'm about to go through really well, you'll be pretty good to go. All right, so let's move on a little bit. Thinking next about coerced labor, and so this is kind of our next topic, so to speak, for today, thinking about changes and continuities in labor systems. And we're going to think about several labor systems that coerce people into working. So your question here is, which of the following coerced labor systems was outlawed by Spain in 1542 because it was deemed too cruel? So your options are chattel slavery, indentured servitude, the Encomienda System, or the Mita System. So A, B, C, or D. Let's see what you have to say. And I won't make you wait so long on this one. All right, so a lot of people choosing A, a few B's and C's in there. Nobody going with well, there's a D. So let's see what our answer is here. As far as labor systems being outlawed, or coerced labor systems, of course, coerced labor here, first of all, let's make sure we have that definition. It is labor or work that is gained through the use of force or threats. We talked about, or your teachers have probably talked about a number of coerced labor systems in your class. Slavery being one of the oldest and coerced labor systems, and one that continues, is a continuity for most of history, right? We know that slavery existed thousands of years ago. We know that there are forms of slavery that exist today, whether it's wage slavery or actual slavery, human trafficking in our modern day. But the slave trade itself, or slavery in the Americas, is not really outlawed until the 19th century. And so A is incorrect, because we're talking about 1542 here, which coincides with a series of laws called the New Laws issued by Spain. Indentured servitude is not outlawed. It continues well after 1542, although it mostly disappears for a while and eventually makes a comeback. So we're down to these last two systems. And the one that was deemed too cruel, and because of the brutality and the poor conditions in which indigenous people were kept in, was actually the Encomienda System. So if you chose C, give yourself a pat on the back. Let's take a look at then this coerced labor and thinking about changes in continuities in this. So first and foremost, let's think about a continuity. Somebody had asked about slavery on the African continent. And so kind of thinking outside of the Americas right now, which of course, if we look back to that essay question from 2015, this would not fit that geography because that question was only on the Americas. But if we think about a continuity of coerced labor kind of in the global system, which most questions nowadays will focus on the global system rather than a specific region. The first one is that slavery in Africa and the slave trade from Africa are a continuity in this time period. There are certainly going to be some changes in the slave trade with Africa, and I will talk about those in a moment. But the use of slaves within households in Africa and the slave trade into the Mediterranean region and the Indian Ocean had been occurring in some cases for thousands of years and was a continuity throughout this time period. So the slave trade with Arab slave traders across the Sahara Desert into the Indian Ocean, that is something that is going to keep happening in the early modern time period. Slaves will be sent into the Indian Ocean, will be sent into the Mediterranean for use in a variety of things, whether to work in homes as servants or to work in fields as agricultural labor. That is something we see pretty much throughout world history. What's important to understand is that the slave trade from Africa into the Mediterranean region and into the Indian Ocean doesn't simply stop because European slave traders start to trade slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. Certainly the numbers in the Atlantic slave trade easily surpass the rest of the African slave trade and the use of slavery in Africa. We're talking in the millions and millions and millions of people being sent into the Atlantic Ocean. But that certainly does not mean that it did not continue elsewhere. That's certainly not a justification for anything. We just want to make sure that we understand that this is an important continuity in slavery from our previous time periods into the early modern time period and even past this time period. So that's the first thing we want to think about. But let's move into changes, because that's what you're all here for anyways. We're thinking then about changes in coerced labor. And the key concepts, I always mention these, right? I screenshotted this from the College Board's key concepts. There are changes in coerced labor. Almost all of this is in a response to the growing demand for goods and labor that coincide with the intensification of trade. Now, that's kind of a lot of big words there, so let's break it down. Coerced labor, labor that is forced, threat of either through threats or actual force. These changes that we're going to talk about, the rise of certain coerced labor systems in the Americas, are a response to the growing trade. The fact that more people are trading, thus trade is intensifying. It means there's a greater demand for goods, both finished and raw material goods, and people have to produce those. The goods that are coming out of the Americas are predominantly going to be created or harvested by coerced labor. So one thing that we'll see is the growth of a plantation economy where cash crops are grown using slave labor. Initially, this was done with native labor enslaved, but because of the effects of disease and harsh treatment, Europeans turn elsewhere to bolster their numbers of laborers, and that is going to be Africa. Colonial economies, of course, in building this are going to depend on coerced labor, but a range of it. So there's four types of coerced labor that we're going to talk about here, and that is the Encomienda System, the Mita System, Indentured Servitude, and Chattel slavery. So that's what we're going to think about kind of from here until the end of this session. So first, let's think about one major change. And this is especially in the Americas. You know, with change and continuity essays, there is a way that you can frame almost any change, any piece of information as a change or continuity. So I'm presenting this Encomienda system to you as a change, but I'm going to mention how it could be a continuity as well. So the Encomienda system itself, first of all, let's just talk about what it is. The Encomienda system was a system of labor whereby conquistadors, these Spanish conquerors, would conquer an area of land, and in exchange for gaining that land for the crown of Spain would be granted dominion over that land, granted control of that land, and anyone who was living on that land. So by taking over this land and controlling the people who were on it, these conquistadors, who are now gigantic landowners, were free to exploit labor in that region. And of course, you can kind of see where this is going. They're free to exploit labor, basically do whatever they want there. We're going to see some pretty harsh treatment as they try to make money immediately after conquering the Americas. But this system was not new for the Spanish. It was new to the Americas. It was the first time that certainly an outside group from Europe had really come to the Americas and enslaved the population. This system itself, this Encomienda system, is perfected basically in Spain, in the Reconquista of Spain, as Spain conquers land fighting Muslim forces on the Iberian Peninsula. And what would happen is you'd conquer a bit of land, you would gain dominion over the Muslims there. Either they converted, or you killed them, or you kicked them out. And you were responsible for feeding them and teaching them in the ways of the Catholic faith in exchange for basically their slave labor. In the Americas, however, because this system was so far outside of the reach of the Spanish crown, there was really no way to regulate this. And so natives are treated extremely harshly. Ultimately, these the natives that we see are some people take up their cause. For example, there are priests. I'm trying to remember the name. Bartolome de las Casas, I think, was one who kind of write to the Spanish crown on behalf of these enslaved peoples, talking about the brutality inherent in this system. And so as a result of this, Spain, understanding that this system was not easily regulated in the Americas because it was so far away, and because natives were dying in massive numbers, and the decline in population of Native Americans really made this system untenable, Spain outlaws this system and replaces it with alternate labor systems. Ultimately, the system was put in place to try to gain wealth as quickly as possible. Encomienda labor was used for mining in Mesoamerica. It was used in agriculture throughout Latin America. But ultimately, it goes by the wayside. It's replaced by the hacienda system, which still granted land, but not necessarily the same ownership of people, but practically controlling all labor in the region within their plantations. They were still exploiting labor in that system. The next change that we're going to see in coerced labor is still going to be this dependence, but it's going to be using perhaps a familiar system. Again, thinking about changes in continuities here. The Encomienda continues from Spain, but is used in the Americas. It is new to the Americas, so we can frame it as a change. The Mita system as well could be framed as either a change or continuity. For example, the Mita system itself was developed by the Inca as a form of corvée labor to have the local indigenous population do work for the state, the Inca Empire. And the Spanish arrive, realizing their Encomienda system and their traditional labor models are not working. They want access, especially to mining silver. And so they adopt the Inca Mita system, which was this corvée system, basically labor as a tax, right? Instead of giving a certain amount of money or wheat, you gave a certain amount of labor. And so they demanded that villages provide a certain number of workers to the Spanish to especially mine silver. And you see the image here that I've chosen is of Potosi, which is the mountain of silver in um, South America that produces massive amounts of silver that eventually are minted in the Spanish peso de ocho, changing global commerce. But this change in this system, this use of this Mita system for the benefit of the Spanish, is an important labor change that we see in this time period. For some reason, I still have peasant agricultural labor at the top. We are talking about coerced labor here. I'm sorry about the heading at the top being incorrect if you're following along there. So let's think about a third change, or a third thing here that we see, and that is one that you may be more familiar with. That is the introduction of a specific type of coerced labor known as indentured servitude. Europeans use this to encourage the settlement of the Americas. Indentured servants were used for agricultural labor, but it was also used for artisan labor. So what would happen is an ad might be put out, and Europeans would advertise for a job in the Americas. If you went, you signed indentures, which is basically a contract saying that whoever was paying your journey over to the Americas would control you, basically, would be responsible for you for 7 years. And in return for this, you owed them labor. You owed them time. Now, you may earn a skill, but if you were going to the Caribbean, you may also be working on a sugar plantation, which was extremely harsh work, very difficult work. Certainly, a lot of indentured servants run away. Ads are put into newspapers seeking these runaway indentured servants who are contractually obligated to fill out their terms of indenture. And as time goes on, Europe has a harder and harder time encouraging people to come to the Americas under indentures because of this exploitation that comes about. Because of this, eventually indentured servitude basically disappears in favor of the rise of chattel slavery, which we're going to talk about next. But in the 19th century, after chattel slavery is abolished in most of the Americas, indentured servitude will make a comeback, although we're not going to be talking about Europeans coming over to the Americas as indentured servants, but South Asian workers or Chinese workers coming to work in the Americas, especially in the British Empire. And the last and single biggest change, ending with the big one here, that occurs in labor systems in this time period is the rise and proliferation of chattel slavery. Now, we use this term chattel slavery to really differentiate this type of slavery from what we may have seen in the rest of world history. Chattel is a word that simply means property. It is something that is owned by someone else. And chattel slavery has existed in the Americas, was basically the idea that slaves were property that was owned. And it also included kind of the idea of a hereditary component, that slavery was not a debt that was paid in one generation because as a slave or as a soldier, you had lost a battle. And so you were taken in and made a slave, and you perhaps would serve out your term, and then your children would be free persons in this new kingdom where they could return home, or you could return home after a certain amount of debt is paid. That was certainly not the idea. This wasn't the type of slavery that we even see throughout the history of the Islamic empires, where people are taken in slavery after being defeated in battle, and then upon converting to Islam, they are freed. Certainly not. Chattel slavery said basically that if your mother was a slave, then you were a slave, and that would happen in perpetuity. Chattel slavery is one of the most significant things that you need to understand in this time period. And so we're going to take a closer look at it right now. First of all, the growth of chattel slavery is facilitated by the rise of the Atlantic trade system. That is the rise of an Atlantic slave trade. There is a forced migration of Africans to the Americas, predominantly from West Africa. And this is heavily connected with the growing demand for sugar in the world. Sugar production, if you look at graphs, I did not pull a graph here, but I needed to look at the trend of sugar production and the demand for sugar production. As it goes up, the number of slaves being brought to the Americas also increases. And this, of course, has massive ramifications outside of just the fact that generations of people, millions of people were enslaved, died along the Middle Passage in the route to the Americas, or died in the extremely harsh conditions of producing sugar for the rest of the world. We also see demographic changes. And that happens in the Americas and Africa, right? So the African population in the Americas will rise. This, of course, becomes significant because the native population in the Americas, especially in Caribbean islands, drops drastically as a result of European diseases and harsh treatment. And so we'll see that rise in African population. In Africa itself, we see a massive gender imbalance. Most of the slaves taken to the Americas, especially the Caribbean, were men. And because a lifespan of a person working on a sugar plantation was drastically shortened because of the harsh conditions, malaria, other diseases that one could get, cruelty in treatment, poor conditions. Because of that, men were constantly being brought over, not to expand necessarily the plantation economy, which was happening, but simply to replace slaves who were dying in this production. So what does that do in Africa? If we think about like a connection to social changes, which is something we need to be thinking about, especially in terms of gender, social structures dealing with gender in Africa, women take on much greater roles in West Africa. They themselves begin taking on becoming heads of households, dealing with agriculture in West Africa. So that's a major effect. Of course, population decline is also an effect. In some areas of sub-Saharan Africa, we see a significant drop in population. Now, the African continent as a whole, their estimates vary. Some say there is a dip in population. Some say that the population growth simply slowed because of the introduction of new American foods that helped offset the slave trade. But nevertheless, one of the trends that we see over time is that the population of Africa does not rise at a level equal to what's going on in Europe or the Americas or South Asia or East Asia. The trend, the rate of change slows drastically in Africa because of this slave trade and because of the demands for human labor in growing cash crops. Now, sugarcane is not the only cash crop these slaves grew. Certainly, they grew subsistence crops, they grew foodstuffs, they grew tobacco, but the sugarcane really is the industry that drives this this change in labor. And again, it is a change. We're thinking change in continuities. This intensification of slavery was a labor system change. So just want to keep that in mind. I want to talk a little bit before we end about social structures, and then I want to spend a little bit of time answering the questions that you have, maybe the last 10 or 15 minutes, answering questions that you've come up. So if you take a look at the question tab on this, and there's a question that you are sharing, go ahead and upvote that, and I'll try to answer them based on the number of upvotes. So fake internet points, they're the best thing ever. In this video, I've tried to elucidate some of the major changes that occur in labor systems while highlighting some of the continuities. So if we think about, slavery is a continuity, but there are changes that take place in the intensification of slavery and in how slavery looks in the Americas. The Encomienda system is used before this time period, it's used into this time period. That might be a continuity, but it's certainly used different in the Americas. Same with the Mita system. Same with peasant agriculture. So that's one thing we see. But if we want to move beyond labor systems, right? If we're thinking about how we write LEQs and we want to get that analysis and reasoning point, that elusive sixth point, then we might want to extend our argument and think not just about how labor systems changed or stayed the same, but also if we think about the effects of these changes and further changes they caused. And so I'm going to connect this to another theme, and that is of social structures. Thinking about how these changes in labor systems ended up creating changes in social structures. And really this is a result of the reliance on coerced labor in Spanish America. That's really what I'm focusing on here. Although if we think about African slavery, pretty much across the Americas, whether you were in the British colonies or whether you were in French Louisiana or whether you were in Spanish America or Portuguese Brazil, African slaves are going to be at the bottom of the social pyramid across the Americas. But in Spanish America, we see a new social pyramid develop. There's a change in social structures that comes about as a result of the Spanish conquest of the New World and the introduction of these new systems of labor, the enslavement of natives and of Africans, and of the arrival of Europeans, whether indentured or free. And we call this system the Casta System. You can see this connection, the word caste, which is a Portuguese word. It's a hierarchical social system. And in Spanish America, it was based on race, entirely on the color of one's skin and what races made up your background. And so I have a question that I'm going to ask here. So last question, feel free to put it in the chat. Hopefully you're still hanging on. Which class was considered, lost it here. Which class was considered the highest in the Casta system of Spanish America? That's where I'm going to start. So I'll give you a moment. I've added 5 answer choices here, throwing you off a little bit. Old style test. Which one was the highest? I mean, the top dogs in this caste system in Spanish America? Excuse me. A lot of people seem pretty sure about this one. I had a lot of people putting in answers right away. Seeing a little variation, but it seems that overall answer D is a favorite. I wonder if anybody's going to buck that trend. All right, nobody chose F, which is good. In the Casta system, the top caste were Europeans, and not just any Europeans, people of European descent, but Europeans who were actually born on the Iberian Peninsula. That is, Spaniards who were born in Spain and thus more connected to the homeland. And we call those folks, obviously because they were born on the peninsula, Peninsulares. So D is our correct answer. Give yourself a pat on the back if you chose that. So D is the best answer. I'm going to keep this up and go through some of these others. Below Peninsulares is a group that is known as the Creoles. They were still very high classes. They're going to be really important in time period 5. They lead revolutions. The Creole class were white Spaniards who were born in the Americas. But below them, this is where we get to see some of the effects of these new labor systems in the Americas. Spanish America was quite different from, let's say, British America, in that there was a lot of interaction between different groups of people, different social groups, thus resulting in a lot of racial mixing in this time period that may not have been seen in the British colonies. And as a result of this, a caste system develops based on race. That is the color of one's skin and what percentage of what race you were. And so this is divided up. You had Peninsulares and Creoles on top because they were white. They were Spanish. It just separated by where they were born. And then we have groups of Mestizos, which were people who are of mixed Spanish and Native American descent, and Mulattos, who are of mixed Spanish and African descent. And then we have this other group, the Zombos, who were of mixed indigenous, native, and African descent. Of course, at the very bottom of this Casta system were African slaves. And that is something that we kind of see across the spectrum. Now, why do we see so many different groups, and why do we see them in this hierarchy? A lot of that is a result of the developments in Spanish America of these new systems of coerced labor, bringing people from different areas of the world together, living in one place, and thus finding a social structure that somehow, at least for people at this time in this place, made sense. And it was a social structure based entirely on race. Another change that occurs in this time period, but one that is a result, especially of the Spanish arriving, enslaving of natives, and the bringing of African slaves to the Americas. So when we think about changes and continuities, it's always good to kind of stretch what we're thinking about and go beyond perhaps just the theme of the essay we're given, if you have time on the essay, mind you. We don't want to forget the changes and continuities in favor of doing just whatever theme we want. But if you have time, there's a way that you can introduce another change that might be as a result of the essay. A good way to kind of stretch your thinking. So that brings me to the end of what I have prepared to present to you tonight. I hope this review of changes and continuities was particularly helpful, and that at a minimum, it helped you to differentiate between some of the labor systems and some of the examples of how labor was used in this time period. And certainly I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that you have developed. So I'm looking particularly at some of these top questions. And the first one is a really, really great question. It's got 15 of them. What's the main difference between peasant labor and being a slave? And it really would depend. It really would depend on where you are and your situation. So let's think about peasant labor for a second in medieval Europe before this time period. Right? Peasants were serfs. They were bound to the land. They couldn't leave the land. They were performing the jobs. They were poor, and they were certainly not free to go where they pleased. It was practically slavery in that sense. So some peasants lived in situations where their rights really weren't much greater than what slaves' rights were, and some they were no different. That said, being a peasant doesn't necessitate that you have no rights. Certainly, you are at the will of the state, but there still is free peasant agriculture that exists in many places, even to the modern day in China and South Asia. But free peasant agriculture was pretty common after the feudal system ends in Europe. It was common throughout Afro-Eurasia. Being a slave meant that you did not have the freedom to make decisions in your own life. Practically everything was at the behest of whoever was responsible for you, whoever your owner was. And this could perhaps coincide with peasant labor, but for the most part, we classify it as a different system because rights are so much more restricted. And there was kind of a specific rule set. I mean, in the United States, for example, which will be in our next time period, obviously, but there were slave codes, laws specifically designed to control the system of slavery, and that existed even earlier. So hopefully that was helpful. I didn't mark that I had started answering that question, so if you end up clicking on this later on, just back up about a minute. The next question looks at how was indentured servitude and slavery affected by the Industrial Revolution? Again, getting into our next time period. So it certainly affects the middle and working class. You're certainly right about that. One thing that we see, so this is kind of a tougher question to answer, because the Industrial Revolution certainly changes agricultural processes, right? So if we get new machinery that can be used on farms, certainly that's going to change the peasant experience. Certainly some peasants can't keep up with this, but I guess I'm getting way too far off. The question is mainly indentured servitude and slavery, right? So indentured servitude is affected by the Industrial Revolution really after slavery goes on the decline. And slavery certainly ends for a number of reasons, really, which I don't think we have time for right now. Of course, there are moral arguments made against slavery that probably are above everything else. The British pressuring certain areas of the Americas to end slavery and end the slave trade. The United States ends slavery over certainly a moral argument put forth by Abraham Lincoln, and then eventually a war that was needed to end it. The Industrial Revolution certainly makes ending slavery more difficult in the United States, for example, because there is a rise in textile production, and as a result, there's a high demand for cotton, which in the American South was produced with slave labor. And so in some way, the Industrial Revolution drives an intensification of slave labor and an argument for keeping slavery, although a losing argument and one that was deeply flawed. Indentured servitude itself is affected because there's still going to be a demand for, excuse me, there's still going to be a demand for raw materials. And if slavery is outlawed and abolished, which it eventually is by the end of the 19th century, there still is a demand for labor to produce those raw materials. And in British colonies specifically, they turned to labor from South Asia. In some regions of the Americas, they turned to labor from Japan. Chinese laborers moving into the Caribbean, especially South Asian workers moving to the Caribbean to work in some of these fields, no pun intended, that are in high demand. So it will indentured servitude will be back on the rise once the slavery declines. And I guess that is all kind of connected to what goes on in the Industrial Revolution. That's covered in Unit 5, and there's even an entire key concept about labor, about migration and labor migration in that time period. Another question, how are the different labor systems going to be referenced on the test? They may be referenced by names or by name, so you may see the Encomienda System or the Mita System mentioned specifically. Certainly slavery would be mentioned specifically. A lot of times you'll find it in the sources. Another question that I've seen before, another type of question, is having the labor system described. So it might be like a source. Some questions I've seen, and they're in a lot of practice materials. You might have like a Spanish priest describing a system of labor, and it might talk about the mining of silver. And it asks you perhaps what labor system is being discussed in that. So it might rely on you to be able to connect a description of that labor with the labor system itself. The best thing to do, I would encourage you to make flashcards to keep some of these straight. I know a lot of people confuse encomienda and hacienda, or encomienda and the Mita system, or even encomienda with chattel slavery, but it is technically a different labor system. How big of a demographic impact did coerced labor have on Latin America? Now, this is a really good question. But because we can look at it in a number of ways, right? So there's certainly a demographic impact on Latin America of slavery, for example, right? We're seeing the influx of millions of slaves, predominantly to the Caribbean and Brazil. If you look at any maps that show kind of the movement of slaves and they indicate numbers, lots of slaves moved to North America, massive amounts, but where sugar plantations are really the areas where you're going to have the highest numbers of slaves, and that's seen in the Caribbean and Brazil. What's really great in the next unit, one of the most fascinating piece of history in the Atlantic revolutions, to me anyways, is the Haitian Revolution, the first in a successful slave revolt in the Americas. So, of course, African forced migration to the Americas is one of the biggest impacts that we see. Another, you might see another impact would be with the Encomienda system or the Mita system. That, of course, affects Native American populations. The harsh treatment, the high death rates in those systems certainly has an impact, but not nearly the same level as Spanish disease or European diseases being introduced. And then lastly, the indentured servitude has a modest effect, especially on the rise of European populations in the Americas. Europeans coming to the Americas, certainly that will have a demographic impact and lead to a diversity of, a racial diversity of the Americas. But the biggest demographic impact is going to be seen, at least in terms of labor, is going to be seen in that forced migration of slaves to the Americas, and then probably the effects of the Encomienda and Mita systems. Answer a couple more of these. What is the importance of the Encomienda system? Oh gosh, I hope I answered it in this video. The brief answer would be, it is really the first labor system that is imposed in the Americas by the Spanish as an attempt to control native labor for Spanish gain. And it was extremely harsh. It also pretty much foreshadowed what was to come with later labor systems. And it really reflected how Europeans began to see native populations, whether it was Native Africans or Native Americans, in comparison to themselves. They were not equals in the eyes of Europeans. They were labor to be exploited. And again, I clicked that a little bit too late, so it may be tagged wrongly in time. I would go back. Single-celled organisms are first. Would peasant labor be a continuity in the labor system of sub-Saharan Africa? I answered that one way earlier. Somebody asked, so the difference between chattel slavery and the encomienda was that chattel was more of a property owner than encomienda being a minion and master. That's a good way of thinking about it, I think. Chattel slavery involved people being picked up in Africa, sold to Europeans, predominantly by African slave traders or African kingdoms who had conquered peoples early on, and then later by slave traders outside of kind of an official conquering, selling system. And they were brought to the Americas, where they were then sold to plantation owners as cattle would be, or any beast of burden. Again, these people were not seen as equal to their owners. The encomienda system, on the other hand, was, maybe we call it de facto slavery. I mean, it was the enslavement of natives. But yes, in a way, they were just these conquistadors the people who had conquered this land were granted control over the population there, as if they were kind of a small feudal lord, over their serfs or slaves in the region. So that might be a difference that you can note. All right, a couple questions that I have answered already, so I'm going to delete one of them out. Which labor systems are going to be compared mostly on tests, or is it mostly random? Well, it's not going to be entirely random in that it's probably going to be one of the ones we went over today. Which one it's going to be, it's up to the testing gods to determine. Did the Reconquista affect the way Spain looked at native Latin Americans? Ooh, that is a good question, and a pretty deep question if it's meant the way I think it's meant. Spaniards, so the Reconquista doesn't refer to the Spaniards conquering the Americas. Obviously, that's just the conquest of the Americas. The Reconquista refers to the Spaniards reconquering the Iberian Peninsula, the country, what makes up now the country of Spain. But I certainly think that it could have had an effect on the way Spain viewed non-Christians as people to be conquered and converted. Of course, the three, major motivations for exploration and conquest are God, glory, gold, right? To spread religion to those who do not have it or do not have the version that the Spanish wanted people to have, to gain glory in conquering things for the motherland, in this case Spain, and of course to make money. And so I think the Reconquista and the fight against Muslims in Spain, and of course the expulsion of Jews as well, certainly shaped a mentality of Spain of spreading their religion at all costs and creating a more Christian world. And that mentality certainly is seen in the conquest of the Americas, although the kind of noble intentions that might be implied by the idea of trying to convert people to Christianity, that was not the priority of people in the Americas. One question: how did tributary states contribute to peasant and slave labor? That is a good question. I am not sure I'm equipped to answer that. If we look in, like in the past at tributary states, so a place like China, perhaps they provided labor of some type. But as far as that question goes, I don't think I have an answer off the top of my head. I would have to do a little bit of research on that. That's a really good question to think about. Certainly some of the products of peasant and slave labor likely would have been part of the tribute systems in those places. And I wish I could give you a better answer. What cash crops did the slaves and natives grow in the Americas? Excellent question. Sugarcane being chief among them. Tobacco would be another. Sorghum might be one. Indigo in South Carolina was a major crop. It could be used as a dye. And then, of course, slave labor and indigenous labor was also used to grow food crops, corn, wheat, etc. But sugar, tobacco, indigo, eventually cotton will become king. But that's really not until the next time period, until the Industrial Revolution. All right, so I'll answer one more because it's about time to wrap up. Let's see. There's a question here, I think, just to kind of think about that social connection. So I'm going to choose this one. Were mulattoes slaves, or do they possess a higher position? So it would certainly depend. If mulattoes who were mixed race, white and African, white, Spanish, and African, it would probably depend on who your parent was, whether or not you would be treated as a slave or be given a higher position in society, perhaps live as like a free person. So it would kind of depend on your parentage and whether or not that parent decided you were free or slave, or whatever the free parent was in that relationship. What we see in the Americas anyways is that typically if a slave owner had a child with a slave, for example, sometimes that child would be given different work to do. It was by no means the rule, and oftentimes the treatment of those were just as cruel as any other slave. But mulattoes themselves, yes, did enjoy, so to speak, a higher social status than did 100% African background slaves. And I'll answer one more here because I really like this question. How does the racial hierarchy of colonial Spanish America influence the social hierarchy in later time periods? Excellent question. It's tough to answer, right? Because we can look in our own society in the United States and make a connection. How did racial hierarchies and the existence of slavery impact us in the modern day? Very much so. The same thing is seen in Latin America. There's in Spanish America, the Creole, for example, are going to lead revolutions in the modern period. Simón Bolivar, himself a Creole, is going to lead revolutions based on Enlightenment ideas, and they're going to espouse things like equality of all, right? That all men are created equal, and all those ideas of the Enlightenment will be used in those. But in the establishment of new governments in places like Mexico or in Colombia, we're still going to see the people at the top of that social hierarchy, of that caste system, be in charge of governments. And those who are lower on that racial hierarchy have fewer and fewer rights. So that's it for me. We got to stop there. If I didn't get to your question, I'm deeply sorry. Thank you all for joining in. We had a massive amount of people, but as I've droned on it here at the end, sorry if I didn't get to your question. Thank you for sticking with me. This has been the Fiveable Cast, looking at changes and continuities on labor systems from 1450 to 1750. I'm Mr. Lassiter, and best of luck. Hope to see you soon.